Hello friends, welcome back to the Military History channel. Today we are going to start with the chapter 8 part 1, that is about recapture of Jhangar. Ladies and gentlemen, the recapture of Jhangar, one of the most crucial and defining moment in the military history. It was more than just a battle, it was a strategic turning point that shifted the balance of power. And this operation not only reclaimed a key position but also set the stage for the broader victories. But friends, why Jhangar was so important and how did its recapture become a game changer? In this video, we'll take a closer look at the pivotal moment, the forces involved and the ripple effect it had on the larger conflict. So stay with us as we unravel the story of the Jhangar recapture and its far-reaching impact. Moving next, in this video friends, we'll cover the recapture of Jhangar under following heads. Friends, the recapture of Jhangar, a defining moment in the military history of India. This is the story of a battle that changed the dynamics of the conflict in March 1948. Jhangar was more than just a piece of land. It was a strategic point that both sides desperately wanted to control. In this video, we'll take you through the meticulous planning, the fierce battle, and ultimate victory that turned the tide in India's favor. We'll cover every critical aspect of the operation, from the strategic importance of Jhangar, the phases of operation, to the key battles that sealed the outcome, Amblidhar and Khaman Ghoshagala. We'll also look at the enemy's dispositions, the role of Indian reinforcements, and the broader impact and the legacy of this operation. So why was Jhangar won back? What was at stake? And what does this battle tell us about the military strategy and bravery? So stay with us as we explore the recapture of Jhangar step by step. Let's start. First we'll talk about recapture of Jhangar. That is first, significance of Jhangar. Let's have a look at the map first. Friends, so why are we talking about the Jhangar today? Because in the grand chessboard of the Indo-Pak conflict, this small town had immense significance. It was not just a name on a map, it was a strategic jewel that both India and Pakistan wanted to control. For Indian forces, its recapture was absolutely critical to securing the larger prize, Kashmir. And why was Jhangar so important? You ask, let me break it down for you. Due to strategic location of Jhangar. Under this, first let's talk about the geographical importance. Friends, you see Jhangar was not just sitting there in isolation. It was located at a critical junction between Jammu Plains and the Kashmir Valley. Controlling Jhangar meant you controlled the arteries that kept the region alive, the supply routes, the communication lines. So imagine trying to defend Kashmir without being able to move troops or supply freely. Impossible, right? So that's exactly why Jhangar was so vital for India. It was the key to keeping the doors to the Kashmir wide open. Then there is a proximity to the line of control, the LOC, the de facto border that divides India and Pakistan controlled Kashmir. Jhangar location near the LOC made it even more a strategic hotspot. Whoever held Jhangar could watch over the key routes along this tense and highly contested border. For Indian forces, it was not just about holding land, it was about defending the gateway to Kashmir. Holding Jhangar meant that they could respond rapidly to any Pakistani moves and keep the upper hand along the LOC. And let's be honest, in a region like Kashmir, having the upper hand on LOC makes all the difference. Friends, but let's zoom out for a moment that this is not just about a single town. It's about the bigger picture. Jhangar was a key to securing the Kashmir region as a whole. Recapturing it allowed Indian forces to reinforce their positions throughout the valley, and with Jhangar back under Indian control, the army could protect its supply lines and bolster its defenses across Kashmir. This was about ensuring stability in a region that was and still is highly contested. Friends, without Jhangar, the Kashmir campaign would have been vulnerable. With it, India ensured that its hold on Kashmir remained strong, its position fortified, and its defenses ready for any eventuality. Now let's flip the script. Before India retook Jhangar, it was a Pakistani stronghold. Pakistani forces used Jhangar to launch attacks into the Kashmir Valley, which disrupt Indian supply lines and try to weaken the Indian positions. They had turned the Jhangar into a launchpad for operation against Indian forces. But when Indian troops recaptured it, it was not just about reclaiming territory, it was about shutting down a key Pakistani operation. Friends, Indian forces essentially cut off a vital base that Pakistan was using to disrupt Indian control over Kashmir. The result? Pakistan's operational capability was significantly weakened. They could no longer launch attacks or challenge Indian dominance in the region from that foothold. Friends, by taking back Jhangar, India not only defended its territory but also disrupted Pakistan's strategy in the Kashmir Valley. And this was not just a win on the battlefield, it was a strategic knockout. Moving next. Next we'll talk about India military operation. Friends, let's take you back to the 1948, a critical moment in India's history when the Indian Army launched a well-coordinated offensive to retake Jhangar. Now this was not just another battle, it was a move that demonstrated India's growing tactical prowess. It was about reclaiming not just territory but control over a key strategic position. So how did the Indian Army pull this off? Let's break it down. First, let's understand why Jhangar was so crucial. It was not just a town, it was a strategic stronghold that held the key to the Kashmir Valley. Whoever controlled Jhangar controlled the vital supply routes and the communication lines. Pakistan had captured this position, giving them a strong foothold. And for India, retaking Jhangar was essential, not just to secure its own operation, but to safeguard Kashmir. Now, to win a battle like this, everything is planning, and the Indian Army knew this very well. They didn't rush into the offensive. Instead, they went through a meticulous planning process, gathering intelligence, analyzing the terrain, and coordination between the various divisions like infantry, artillery, and air support. It was a well-oiled machine where every move was calculated to perfection. And this operation was not just about strength, it was about strategy. Friends, once the planning was in place, it was the time for execution. And this is where Indian military brilliance really stood out. The army launched a multi-pronged assault, attacking Pakistani defenses from multiple angles. The goal was simple: stretch the army thin, disorient them, and overwhelm their defenses. With each front, the Pakistani forces found themselves under pressure, unable to hold their ground effectively. Friends, India's tactical plan was working. But here is what made the operation even more powerful, that is air support. The Indian Air Force played a crucial role in this offensive. They were not just there for the show, they were conducting precision strikes on key enemy positions. This weakened the Pakistani stronghold and allowed the Indian infantry to advance more swiftly. Ground and air coordination worked like a charm, making sure that the enemy supply lines were cut off and their defenses shattered. But a multi-pronged assault and an airstrike can only succeed with one crucial ingredient: precision and timing. The Indian Army knew exactly when and where to strike. Every artillery bombardment was followed by a perfectly timed infantry advances. airstrikes executed with pinpoint accuracy. And this level of coordination and tactical precision showcased the Indian Army ability to outthink and outmaneuver the enemy at every turn. And if the fighting a coordinated enemy, it was not enough. The Indian forces had to deal with the harsh terrain. The region around Jhangar is known for its rugged, mountainous landscape, making troops' movement difficult and dangerous. But here is where India's strategic preparation paid off. The army had carefully studied the terrain and used it to their advantage, launching surprise attacks from unexpected directions. They overcame every obstacle, both human and geographic, because they were prepared, precise, and determined. Moving next we'll talk about aftermath and implication. Friends, the Battle of Jhangar was not just about reclaiming a town. It marked the turning point in the Indo-Pak conflict. The successful recapture of this strategic location had far-reaching consequences. Not only did it bolster India's military position in the war, but it also played a significant role in influencing the eventual ceasefire. Let's break it down, the aftermath and why this victory mattered so much. First, let's talk about the territory. Friends, Jhangar location was key. It was not just any town, it was the gateway to the Kashmir Valley, a crucial hub for the controlling supply lines and communication routes. So by retaking Jhangar, Indian forces didn't just reclaim land, they solidified their hold over the region. And this victory gave India a firm grip on the routes that fed their troops across Kashmir, ensuring that supplies and reinforcements could flow uninterrupted. With Jhangar under Indian control, the army could now fortify its presence across the region, securing its grip on the vital routes that were essential for winning the larger conflict. But this victory was not just about land. It was a psychological win as well. The successful operation to recapture Jhangar gave Indian troops a much needed morale boost. It showed that India could launch well-coordinated, successful offensive against a formidable opponent. And the timing of this victory is crucial. It came at a point when India needed momentum to keep pushing forward. The morale boost empowered Indian forces to keep up the pressure on the Pakistani troops, fueling future victories in the Kashmir region and putting Pakistan on the back foot. Now let's look at the flip side, what this meant for the Pakistan. The loss of Jhangar was more than just a defeat. It was a significant blow to their strategy. Jhangar had been a critical base for the Pakistani forces to launch operations into the Kashmir. And losing it was not just about losing ground, it disrupted Pakistan's entire military strategy in the region. Pakistan's ability to coordinate further offensive was severely diminished, and their hold on the important supply routes weakened. They were forced to retreat from the several key positions. And it didn't stop there. The fall of Jhangar triggered a domino effect on the Pakistani defensive lines in the region. With Jhangar gone, Indian forces could launch further offensive into surrounding areas. Pakistani troops now on the defensive were struggling to regroup and hold onto the key positions. Pakistan's overall military posture weakened significantly, making it harder for them to mount any serious counter-offensive. This loss of territory put Pakistan on a much weaker front footing for the remainder of the conflict. Now let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. The recapture of Jhangar didn't just affect the battlefield, it influenced the ceasefire negotiations and that were to follow. by securing Jhangar and other key strategic points, India had shifted the balance of power in its favor. This meant that when it came for the ceasefire talks, India was negotiating from a position of strength. The success at Jhangar helped Indian Army during the United Nations-led ceasefire negotiation. India's control over critical positions allowed it to shape the terms of a ceasefire in a way that it favored its interest. Friends, the recapture of Jhangar was more than a military victory. It was a strategic turning point that influenced the course of the conflict and eventual ceasefire. It showcased India's tactical prowess, weakened Pakistan's hold on the critical position, and allowed India to negotiate from a position of strength in the international arena. Moving next, start with the introduction. Friends, the origin of the Indo-Pakistani War lie in the aftermath of partition in 1947. And as the subcontinent was divided, a dispute emerged over the princely states of Jammu and Kashmir, a region that both India and Pakistan sought to control. What followed was the conflict that would shape the geopolitics of the region for decades to come. Friends, in this series, we'll delve into the roots of this war, how a disagreement over a princely states turned into one of the most significant and long-standing conflict in South Asia. What were the stakes and how did this territorial dispute evolve into a full-blown war? Let's take you back to the India 1947, the year of partition. Friends, India and Pakistan had just been born as two separate nations, but the seed of conflict was sown almost immediately. The issue, the princely states of Jammu and Kashmir. Both nations laid claim to this beautiful yet strategically vital region, and soon enough, this dispute led to the first of many wars between India and Pakistan. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1947-48 was not just a broader conflict, it was a battle over control, identity, and survival. Let's break it down and understand it better. Friends, why was Jhangar so important? It was not just a dot on the map. This town lays a crucial crossroad of the crucial routes that connected the Jammu region over the Kashmir Valley. Its location along the southern sector of the line of control made it a strategic gateway for the movement of the military forces and supplies. Whoever controlled Jhangar led the key to the dominating access to the northern areas of Jammu and Kashmir. And for both India and Pakistan, controlling these routes was crucial for maintaining military dominance in the region. Let's take this step further. Jhangar was not just about geography, it was about communication and logistics. Being situated along essential supply routes meant that the controlling Jhangar was vital for maintaining smooth lines of communication and reinforcing troops. When Pakistan gained control over Jhangar in 1947, it severely disrupted India's ability to send reinforcement and supplies to its forces in the region. It created a major logistical setback for India, making the recapture of Jhangar absolutely critical for restoring their operational strength and reclaiming control over vital supply lines. So there you have it. The origin of Indo-Pakistani War lay in the broader struggle for Kashmir. But significance of a small yet strategic town like Jhangar cannot be overstated. Friends, why Jhangar became a crucial battleground? Now let's get to the real prize in this conflict, the Kashmir Valley. This was the heart of the larger struggle between India and Pakistan. Whoever controlled the valley controlled the future of Jammu and Kashmir. And here is where Jhangar comes in. It was not just a broader town, it was the key to accessing the Kashmir Valley. Why? Because holding Jhangar allowed either side to launch further offensives into the valley or defend against enemy advances. It was a launchpad for any major military operation in the region. And without Jhangar, moving troops or supplies into the valley became much harder. Control over Jhangar directly influenced the course of military operations and troop movement in the Kashmir, making it a top target for both India and Pakistani forces. But there is another layer to this story, the line of control. Jhangar proximity to the line of control made it even more of just a hotspot. It was not just about geography, it was about territorial disputes. Both India and Pakistan knew the strategic value of Jhangar for defending or advancing positions along the LOC. The town was constantly at the center of intense fighting. Whoever controlled Jhangar gained a significant tactical advantage over the southern sector of LOC. And this was not just a local battle, it was a fight that had implication for the entire region. Holding Jhangar meant controlling one of the most contested and the crucial points of the Indo-Pak conflict. So friends, when we ask why Jhangar became a battleground, the answer is simple. Its strategic importance. It was the gateway to the Kashmir Valley. A critical point over the line of control and a target both sides knew that they couldn't afford to lose. Moving next. Friends, let me take you back to the 1947. India and Pakistan had just gained independence, but peace was not in their cards. The princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, a region both countries laid claim to, became the flashpoint of their first war. And at the heart of this conflict was a small yet extremely strategic town that is Jhangar. Now Jhangar was not just any town, it was a gateway to the Kashmir Valley, a crossroad of supply routes and communication lines. And whoever controlled Jhangar could move forces, secure supply chains, and most importantly, control access to the Kashmir Valley. But let's break it down in the December 1947. Pakistani forces made a bold move. They seized Jhangar. For India, this was a major blow. With Jhangar under Pakistani control, India's supply lines were cut off and their position in the Kashmir was suddenly on a shaky ground. Pakistan now had an upper hand using Jhangar as a base of operation to launch further offensive into the region. It was a critical point and its capture meant Pakistan could disrupt Indian operations at will. This is where things get serious. Losing Jhangar was not just about territory. It was about logistics and survival. And with Pakistani forces in control, India's ability to send reinforcements, weapons and supplies to its troops in Kashmir was severely limited. Pakistan's position became stronger and India's position was weakened. This is why Jhangar became a priority for India to recapture, and losing it was not an option India could afford if they wanted to maintain control over Kashmir. Fast forward to March 1948, the Indian army was not sitting idle. After months of planning, they launched a well-coordinated offensive to take Jhangar back. And this was not just any military operation, it was a strategic masterpiece. The goal was clear: without Jhangar, India's position in Kashmir would remain compromised. They knew that retaking this town would restore their control over vital military and logistical networks, allowing them to push deeper into the Kashmir Valley and continue operations. Now let's talk about the recapture of Indian forces moved in with precision. Friends, the Pakistani forces were stretched thin. The Indian troops were relentless, and after fierce fighting, Jhangar was back in the Indian hands. This victory was not just about reclaiming territory, it was about turning the tide in the larger conflict over Kashmir. But what was the impact of this capture? Friends, by retaking Jhangar, India has restored its control over crucial supply routes and communication network. It allowed them to reinforce their position across region and keep their forces supplied and ready for further operations. But more than that, it gave India the momentum it needed. The morale boost for the Indian troops was undeniable, and after months of uncertainty, they had won a decisive battle. This victory not only strengthened India's tactical position in Kashmir but also sent a clear message. India was not backing down. But what about Pakistan? Friends, the loss of Jhangar was a major blow to this strategy. Jhangar had been a key base for Pakistani operations, and losing it meant that they could no longer launch offensive into the Kashmir Valley as easily. Their control over supply routes was weakened, and they were now on the back foot, forced to regroup and rethink their strategy. Moving next is about Indian Army offensive maneuver, the tactical recapture of Jhangar. Friends, in 1948, the Indian Army launched a strategically crucial offensive to retake the town of Jhangar, a pivotal point in the Kashmir conflict. And this was not just a battle, it was a testament to the India's growing military capabilities and their determination to secure the Kashmir region from Pakistani advances. Now let's talk about the planning that went into the operation. This was not just a spur of the moment assault, it was a meticulously planned offensive designed to break through the fortified enemy position. The Indian Army relied heavily on the intelligence gathering and to prepare for this operation. So they studied the terrain closely, identified enemy positions, and understood the importance of coordination between their forces. First, they unleashed a series of artillery bombardment to weaken the Pakistani fortifications. This was followed by a coordinated infantry advances, timed perfectly to exploit the weakened defenses. But here is the key. The Indian forces also secured nearby high ground, giving them a tactical advantage over the entrenched Pakistani troops. Friends, this was not just a random assault. It was a highly calculated move. And then there was a question of timing. The operation was not just well coordinated. It was launched with precision. Indian forces used diversionary tactics to mislead the enemy. While Pakistani forces expected the main assault from one direction, Indian forces launched surprise attack from multiple fronts, overwhelming them. The element of tactical deception played a critical role in the success of the operation. Pakistani forces were caught off guard by the Indian military-pronged attack, which left them scrambling to defend their positions. India's ability to execute such a precise and well-timed assault showcased their growing military expertise and signaled their determination to secure Kashmir. Friends, now let's talk about how the Indian Army assault was executed with military precision. This was not just a simple charge into the battle. It was a carefully coordinated effort between artillery and infantry units. First, the Indian forces unleashed the powerful artillery barrage. This was designed to soften up the enemy defenses, hitting Pakistani positions hard and creating gaps in their fortifications. But here is the brilliance. The artillery fire was immediately followed by rapid infantry movements. Indian troops did not waste a moment. They advanced swiftly to capitalize on damage caused by the artillery. Friends, the close coordination between artillery and infantry was key. The Pakistani forces already entrenched were overwhelmed by the synchronized assault. They were unable to regroup or mount effective defenses. The rapid infantry advances took them by surprise, forcing them into a defensive retreat. And this was not just an attack, it was a well-orchestrated military maneuver. Friends, but The real genius of the Indian Army assault lay in their ability to adapt to the evolving battlefield conditions. As the battle raged on, Indian forces were quick to exploit weaknesses in the Pakistani defenses. They didn't just rely on their initial plan, they adapted to the enemy's movement and struck where it hurt the most. By late March 1948, the Indian Army had sealed their victory. They successfully retook Jhangar and restoring critical supply lines and reclaiming a strategic stronghold in the Kashmir conflict. Friends, the Indian Army operation to recapture Jhangar was not just about a brute force. It was a masterclass in military planning and coordination. Every phase of the assault was carefully calculated. From the initial artillery bombardment to the synchronized infantry advances, nothing was left to the chance. The army's ability to coordinate multiple fronts, adapt to battlefield conditions, and exploit enemy weaknesses showed just how far India's military capability had come since independence. Friends, beyond the sheer military victory, this operation was about more than just winning a battle. It was about securing the Kashmir region. Retaking Jhangar was crucial not only for the restoring supply lines and reinforcing troops, but for bolstering India's position. It demonstrated India's determination to protect and secure its interest in Jammu and Kashmir. Moving next we'll talk about the strategic importance. Friends, when we talk about the strategic significance of Jhangar in Indo-Pakistani conflict, its location is everything. Jhangar was not just a small town in Jammu and Kashmir, it was a strategic asset, situated along the line of control, and this town held a key to the controlling essential supply routes and communication lines that stretched across the Kashmir Valley. So let's take a closer look at why Jhangar was so important. Friends, first we need to understand where Jhangar was positioned. Friends, Jhangar sat at a crucial intersection right near the line of control, which marked the dividing line between India and Pakistani forces in Jammu and Kashmir. This was not just a geographical boundary, it was a strategic fault line in the conflict. And controlling Jhangar meant controlling the access to the main routes that connected the Jammu region to the Kashmir Valley. And these routes were critical not just for troop movement but for the supply deliveries and communication. But geography alone didn't make Jhangar valuable. Its proximity to the key roads network was what truly elevated its significance. These roads were not just local, they were lifelines during the conflict. Jhangar's location allowed military forces to control vital supply lines, making it essential for transporting reinforcement, food, ammunition, and other supplies. So friends, when we talk about the geographical significance of Jhangar, we are not just discussing a town on the map. We are talking about a strategic hub that controlled the very lifeline of the war, the roads, routes, and the communication lines. Friends, Jhangar was a gateway to the Kashmir Valley, and whoever controlled it controlled the flow of supply and troops. Moving next. Friends, when it comes to strategic location, Jhangar was not just valuable to its proximity to the supply routes. It was also a crucial communication hub. Its position played a vital role in ensuring that Indian forces could maintain a clear lines of communication across the region. Friends, in any conflict, especially one as fast-moving as the Indo-Pakistani War over Kashmir, communication can be the difference between success and failure. So let's break down why Jhangar's location was so critical. Friends, first and foremost, Jhangar's location was pivotal in keeping the line of communication open between various military posts scattered across Jammu and Kashmir. And with control over Jhangar, Indian forces could efficiently coordinate operations and stay connected with their outposts and forward positions. Friends, effective communication during a conflict is essential, and especially in rugged terrain like Kashmir. So, by maintaining these communication lines, Indian forces were able to coordinate military operation smoothly and respond swiftly to changing battlefield conditions. This level of coordination was critical in maintaining an upper hand during such a dynamic and fast-paced conflict. Friends, but it was not just about communication. Jhangar's geographical position gave it another advantage. It sat on the high ground. This provided our Indian forces with a strategic vantage point, making it easier to monitor enemy movements and prepare for the potential attacks. Moving next. Now let's zoom out and look at the broader significance of the Jhangar in the larger context of the Kashmir conflict. This was not just a battle of a town. It was about shaping the war itself. Whoever controlled Jhangar controlled much more than just supply lines and communication routes. They held the strategic upper hand in the struggle of Jammu and Kashmir. Friends, Jhangar location was along the line of control was critical, not just for its immediate military value, but also for its long-term influence. This town acted as a linchpin in the securing access to the crucial areas in Jammu and Kashmir. When Indian forces recaptured Jhangar in 1948, they did more than restore supply and communication lines. They shifted the balance of power, whereas with Jhangar back in Indian hands, India regained the upper hand in Kashmir conflict, strengthening their military and strategic positioning across the region. Friends, but Jhangar's significance didn't end with its recapture. In the long run, the town became a symbol of the ongoing territorial dispute over Jammu and Kashmir. Its location along the line of control meant that it would continue to play a pivotal role in future military decisions. The strategic value of Jhangar had echoed through the years, influencing military operations and shaping the broader Kashmir dispute. Moving next discuss about the tactical importance of recapturing Jhangar. Friends, the recapture of Jhangar in 1948 was not just a military win. It was a tactical game changer. And by regaining its strategic town, Indian forces were able to secure critical access to the Kashmir Valley and disrupt Pakistani operations in the region. Let's break down why this victory was so pivotal. Friends, first and foremost, Jhangar was the gateway to the Kashmir Valley. The town sat at the crossroad of major routes leading into the valley, making it vital for moving troops and supplies. Whoever controlled Jhangar essentially controlled the access point to one of the most contested regions in the entire conflict. But this was not just about geographic access. It was about logistics, reopening crucial supply lines, and that had been cut off by the Pakistani forces. These routes were essential for transporting food, ammunition, and other supplies to the Indian troops stationed in the valley. Friends, beyond securing access, the recapture of Jhangar had a devastating effect on the Pakistani military operations. Jhangar had served as a base for launching attack into the Kashmir Valley and beyond, and by retaking it, Indian forces effectively cut off Pakistani troops from key positions and supply routes. Not only did this disrupt Pakistani operation, but it also allowed Indian forces to preempt further attacks. And with Jhangar under this control, Indian troops could now monitor enemy movements and prepare for potential offensive from a position of strength. Moving next, friends, but the victory at Jhangar was not just about the immediate gains. It had a long-term implication. By stabilizing this critical part of the region, Indian forces were able to solidify their control over the Kashmir Valley, ensuring that Pakistani forces could not easily launch future offensive. And finally, we cannot overlook the morale boost this victory gave to the Indian forces. After months of fighting and setbacks, the recapture of Jhangar was a decisive win that energized the troops. It proved that India had the strength, strategy, and determination to defend its territory. In conclusion, we can say that the tactical importance of recapturing Jhangar cannot be overstated. It secured access to the Kashmir Valley, disrupted Pakistani operations, and provided long-term advantage that would shape the course of the conflict. Moving next, friends, let's discuss about an impact on the Indo-Pakistani conflict. Friends, let me take you back to the year 1948, a pivotal year in the Indo-Pakistani conflict. Amidst the rugged terrain of Jammu and Kashmir, one small town played a disproportionately larger role in shaping the war, that is Jhangar. Friends, when Indian forces successfully recaptured Jhangar, it was not just a military win, it was a turning point, one that would alter the balance of power and help pave the way for the eventual ceasefire. So why was this victory so significant? Let's break it down. Friends, first let's talk about the strategic victory. Jhangar was not just another town, it was a strategic stronghold. Friends, whoever controlled Jhangar had control over critical supply routes crucial for moving troops and resources into the Kashmir Valley. And in March 1948, after fierce fighting, India retook Jhangar, securing those vital supply lines. But beyond the logistics, this victory gave Indian forces something equally important, a massive morale boost. After the months of grueling conflict, the recapture of Jhangar was the victory Indian troops needed. It proved that India had the strategic brilliance and the military strength to defend its territory. Friends, now let's move on from the battlefield to the negotiation table. When it came time for ceasefire talks, India was not just bringing words, they were bringing victories. And Jhangar was one of the most important. With this strategic victory, India walked into negotiations with a much stronger hand. Friends, before Jhangar, the conflict was tittering. But after the recapture, the balance of power shifted decisively in India's favor. The victory signaled to the world that India was not only holding its ground, but actively securing key areas in Jammu and Kashmir. Friends, but here is the thing. Jhangar was not just a temporary victory. It had a long-term implication for the entire region. By regaining control over this critical town, India was able to solidify its control over Jammu and Kashmir. It was not just about winning a battle, it was about ensuring sustained dominance in the region. And finally, Jhangar's strategic location had another lasting impact. It helped influence the eventual demarcation of the line of control. The LOC, which today divides India and Pakistani controlled areas of Kashmir, was shaped by the victories like this one. So to sum it up, the recapture of Jhangar was not just a tactical victory, it was a turning point into the Indo-Pakistani conflict. It bolstered India's military position, gave them the upper hand in the ceasefire negotiations, and had long-term implications for the India's control over Jammu and Kashmir. Moving next, let's talk about the phases of operation. Friends, under the phases of operation, let me take you back to the 1948, a time when the stakes in the Jammu and Kashmir were at the highest. Indian forces were facing a monumental challenge, recapturing the strategically vital town of Jhangar. This was not just any operation, it was a meticulously planned, multi-phased military campaign that showcased India's growing military might and strategic prowess. But here is the thing, victories like these don't happen overnight. They are the result of careful planning, precision, and flawless execution. The operation to retake Jhangar was no different. It was executed in phases, each one more critical than the last, and every move was calculated, every tactic deliberate. So how did this India pull this off? Let's break it down by the step and walk through the phases of operation that helped to the changed the courses of the conflict. Friends, when we talk about the probing attack, especially in February 1948, we are not talking about major assault. We are talking about calculated skirmishes designed to test the enemy. The goal: to assess the Pakistani defenses and identify key weaknesses before launching a full-scale offensive. This phase of the conflict laid the groundwork for what would become India's larger military strategy to retake Jhangar. Friends, first let's define what probing attacks are. Friends, these are the small scale skirmishes that are not meant to win territory but to test the waters, to understand the enemy's strength and, more importantly, their weaknesses. In the case of 7 to 29 Feb 1948 skirmishes, these probing attacks were vital for gathering intelligence. Indian forces used them to get a better understanding of Pakistani positions, identifying where their defenses were strongest and where they might be vulnerable. But why are these small skirmishes so critical? Because they help shape the bigger picture. Friends, without knowing the lay of the land or enemy's position, launching a major offensive would be a gamble. And by carrying out these probing attacks, Indian forces could strategize and refine their plan of attack, making sure that when the time came, their large offensives would hit the right target. Friends, let's take a closer look at what happened during those weeks in Feb 1948. Indian forces launched a series of initial skirmishes against Pakistani positions. These were not full-scale engagements but rather calculated strikes designed to test Pakistan's defensive capabilities. Each skirmish was carefully planned and with the objective of understanding how Pakistani forces would respond. Alongside these skirmishes, there was a strong focus on reconnaissance. Indian troops were not just fighting, they were observing, analyzing, and learning. The goal was to gather intelligence, to map out Pakistani fortifications, understand their troop movement, and understand how well supplied they were. Friends, once the probing attack had been carried out, Indian forces began identifying key weak points in the Pakistani defenses. Whether it was under defended positions or logistical vulnerabilities, these skirmishes exposed the gaps in the Pakistani lines. Now armed with a wealth of intelligence, Indian forces were able to refine their offensive plan. And based on the insight gathered from these probing attacks, they were exactly where to strike, how to overwhelm enemy defenses, and which areas to avoid. These attacks were not just about gathering data. They were about fine-tuning the strategy for the larger offensive that would follow. The result: a well-calibrated plan that would maximize the effectiveness of India's military operations in the region. Friends, the probing attack of the Feb 1948 were a crucial phase in the Indian larger strategy. They were not just designed to deliver immediate victories, but to gather intelligence and refine India's battle plan. Moving next, let's talk about the double thrust against Amblidhar and Khaman Ghoshagala. Friends, the Indo-Pakistani conflict of 1948 was not just about securing land. It was a battle of strategy, precision, and timing. One of the most pivotal moments in this conflict was a double thrust, a coordinated assault launched by Indian forces against the two key Pakistani strongholds, that is Amblidhar and Khaman Ghoshagala. These from the 1st to 4th March 1948. These attacks were meticulously designed to disrupt Pakistani defenses and pave the way for the recapture of Jhangar. So friends, let's dive into why these two strongholds were so significant and how the Indian forces executed this brilliant military maneuver. Let's understand why Amblidhar and Khaman Ghoshagala were key targets in this operation. Friends, both were the Pakistani strongholds positioned strategically to block the Indian advances. These strongholds controlled the high ground and crucial defensive position along the approaches to the Jhangar. But more than just holding the high ground, the Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala were integral part of the Pakistani defensive lines. They were designed to protect Jhangar and prevent Indian forces from advancing further into the region. Now let's talk about the double thrust strategy from 1st to 4th March 1948. Indian forces launched coordinated assault on both Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala. The idea was simple but brilliant. Hit these two strongholds simultaneously, overwhelming Pakistani defenses and forcing them to divide their forces. Friends, Indian artillery barrage did both positions hard, followed by a swift infantry assault. The timing of these attacks was crucial. So by attacking both strongholds at the same time, Indian forces ensured that Pakistani troops could not reinforce one position without weakening the other. And this was all about strategy and precision. But the double thrust was not just about attacking, it was about disrupting. The aim was to create confusion within the Pakistani lines, stretching their defenses thin and making it difficult for them to mount an effective counter-attack. Friends, by hitting 2 points at once, Indian forces managed to disrupt communication and logistical support within Pakistani ranks. This move weakened Pakistani ability to hold their defensive lines and prepared the ground for the final assault on Jhangar. Now let's break down the operation. The first major focus was on Amblidhar. Friends, a vital stronghold due to its elevation and control over the routes leading to Jhangar. Friends, Indian forces concentrated their artillery and infantry attacks on this position, understanding that controlling this high ground was critical. Simultaneously, Indian infantry units launched an aggressive assault on Khaman Goshagala, another vital position protecting Jhangar western approach. This was a strategic engagement designed to keep the pressure on the Pakistani forces and stretch their defenses even thinner. Friends, so what was the impact of the double thrust? It significantly weakened the Pakistani defenses around Jhangar, making it easier for the Indian forces to prepare for both their final offensive. And with both Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala under Indian control, the path to clear Jhangar was now clear. But it was not just about military tactics. This assault has a profound psychological impact. Friends, the loss of these key positions dealt a significant blow to the morale of Pakistani forces, who now had to regroup under less favorable conditions. Friends, the double thrust against the Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala was a turning point in India's campaign to recapture Jhangar. And these coordinated attacks not only disrupted Pakistani defenses but also cleared the path for the final push. Moving next. Friends, let's discuss about the Operation Vijay, which took place between 5th and 18th March 1948. Friends, in March 1948, the Indian Army launched a critical offensive, that is Operation Vijay. And this was a turning point in the Indo-Pakistani conflict over Kashmir. The goal to recapture Jhangar, a town of immense strategic importance. And this was not just about reclaiming lost ground, it was about restoring control over supply routes and reinforcing India's presence in the Kashmir region. Friends, let's dive into the key phases of this operation and how it unfolded. Friends, Operation Vijay played a critical role in restoring India's control over Jhangar, a town that was essential for maintaining access to the Kashmir Valley and controlling crucial supply routes. So now let's break down why Jhangar was so important and how the operation was executed. Friends, why did Jhangar matter so much? It was not just any town. It was a strategic gateway. Jhangar locations along key supply routes made it vital for the controlling access to Kashmir Valley. And this gave whoever held it a directly military advantage in northern Jammu and Kashmir. Friends, by February 1948, Indian forces were ready. They had already conducted probing attacks and reconnaissance missions to assess Pakistani defenses. This allowed them to gather vital intelligence on enemy positions and weak points. Armed with this knowledge, Indian military planners are prepared to launch an Operation Vijay in early March. Friends, Now the Operation Vijay was not just a single strike. It involved coordinated attacks and by infantry, artillery and support units. The Indian Army's strategy was clear: soften enemy position with artillery bombardments and then send in the infantry to take advantage of the weakened defenses. The first phase of Operation Vijay began on 5 March 1948 with a series of artillery bombardments. Indian forces focused on weakening Pakistani fortifications around Jhangar. Their goal: control the high ground, which was a key to gaining a tactical advantage. Then came the final push from 11 March. Indian infantry launched a full-scale assault on the Jhangar. The fighting was fierce and intense, but by 18 March, Indian forces had decisively recaptured the town. Friends, the loss of Jhangar was a massive blow to the Pakistani military operations, and with Indian forces now in control of the critical town, Pakistan lost a vital stronghold, making it extremely difficult for them to regroup and plan counter-attacks. But Operation Vijay was not just a tactical success. It was also a strategic and psychological victory. For India, it was a clear demonstration of their military capabilities, and for Indian troops, the recapture of Jhangar was a huge morale boost. Friends, to sum it up, we can say that the Operation Vijay was a decisive moment in the Indo-Pakistani conflict. The recapture of Jhangar restored critical supply routes, disrupted Pakistani operations, and bolstered India's strategic position in the region. Moving next, let's talk about the enemy dispositions. In March 1948, as the Indian Army prepared to recapture Jhangar, they knew they were up against a formidable enemy. Pakistani forces had heavily fortified the town, making it one of the most difficult and crucial targets in the conflict over Kashmir. Friends, as we break down the strength and setup of Pakistani forces in Jhangar, you will see just how challenging the task was for the Indian forces. First, let's talk about the strength of the Pakistani forces. So, what was India up against? Pakistani forces defending Jhangar were estimated to number around 3,000 soldiers. This was no small contingent. These troops were well entrenched in defensive positions, ready to resist any advances. These numbers were significant. Holding Jhangar with such a substantial force meant that Indian forces faced a major challenge in trying to break through these defenses and reclaim the town. Now let's talk about the defensive setup. Pakistani forces used the natural terrain around Jhangar to their advantage. They built extensive fortification, sandbags, reinforcement, trenches and bunkers, creating positions that were tough to break. These fortifications gave Pakistani troops strong cover against artillery and infantry assault. Even under heavy Indian bombardment, these defenses allowed them to delay Indian progress significantly during the offensive. But it was not just about number of fortifications. Pakistani forces were equipped with heavy artillery and mortar. These weapons were a game changer. From their positions, Pakistani troops could shell Indian forces and disrupt their movement. With long-range artillery placements, Pakistani forces made it extremely difficult for the Indian troops to cross open ground. The presence of heavy artillery gave Pakistani forces a long-range advantage, which became a critical factor in their ability to slow down the Indian advances. Friends, Pakistani forces didn't stop there. They tactically deployed mortars to target advancing Indian infantry. Mortars were strategically placed around Jhangar, creating kill zones that made any approach dangerous for the Indian troops. When it comes to strategy, Pakistani troops opted for a defensive posture. Rather than engaging in large-scale counterattack, they focused on holding their fortified positions and using artillery and mortars to weaken Indian forces over time. This defensive strategy allowed them to hold Jhangar for an extended period, making the battle a protracted and challenging one for the Indian army. Friends, and then there was a high ground. Pakistani forces controlled key elevated positions around Jhangar, giving them a commanding view of the battlefield, and this made it easier for them to monitor Indian movements and target advancing troops with precision. Moving next, let's talk about the Pakistani strongholds. As Indian forces advanced toward the strategic town of Jhangar in March 1948, two heavily fortified Pakistani strongholds stood in their way, Amblidhar and Khaman Kosha Kala. These positions was critical, controlling access to the Jhangar, and if India wanted to recapture Jhangar, these strongholds had to be neutralized first. So friends, let's explore why these two strongholds were so crucial to the Pakistani defenses and the challenges they posed to the Indian forces. First, we'll talk about the key Pakistani strongholds. Let's start with Amblidhar, a key defensive position located on the elevated terrain. This stronghold was heavily fortified by the Pakistani forces and provided them with a commanding view of the surrounding area. From Amblidhar, Pakistani troops could easily monitor Indian movements and use artillery to shell advancing Indian forces. Its elevation made it nearly impossible for the Indian troops to approach without being exposed to the enemy fire, making it a crucial defensive point on the path to Jhangar. Next, we have Khaman Kosha Kala, another critical Pakistani stronghold located near the important supply routes leading directly into the Jhangar. Its position allowed Pakistani forces to disrupt Indian troops' movement and prevent reinforcements from reaching the front lines. Friends, like Amblidhar, Khaman Kosha Kala was fortified with artillery and mortars, giving Pakistani troops the ability to hold off Indian forces and delay any direct assault on the Jhangar. Friends, both Amblidhar and Khaman Kosha Kala were heavily fortified. Pakistani forces had built trenches, bunkers, and positioned artillery to defend these strongholds. These defenses made it extremely difficult for Indian forces to advance without taking heavy casualty. The fortifications allowed Pakistani troops to hold their ground for extended period, delaying the Indian advances and forcing Indian commanders to carefully plan their assault. But there was more at the stake than just fortified positions. Both strongholds were strategically located near critical supply and communication routes. As long as Pakistani forces controlled Amblidhar and Khaman Kosha Kala, Indian forces struggled to secure these routes, which were essential for bringing in reinforcement and supplies. Friends, control over these strongholds enabled Pakistani forces to disrupt Indian logistics, making it difficult for the Indian forces to maintain momentum as they prepared for the final push. Friends, to break through these defenses, Indian forces needed a bold strategy. In early March 1948, Indian commanders launched coordinated attacks on both strongholds. The plan overwhelmed Pakistani defenses and paved the way for the final assault on Jhangar. Friends, Indian forces began by using artillery bombardments to weaken Pakistani positions, followed by infantry assaults that targeted specific weak points identified during early reconnaissance and probing attack. But what made this strategy successful was the simultaneous attack on both Amblidhar and Khaman Kosha Kala. And by hitting these positions at the same time, Indian forces divided Pakistani defenses, preventing them from reinforcing one position without leaving the other vulnerable. The success of this double thrust broke through the Pakistani defensive lines, allowing Indian forces to secure these strongholds and clear the way for final push toward Jhangar. Friends, Amblidhar and Khaman Kosha Kala were two key Pakistani strongholds that controlled access to the Jhangar. These fortified positions posed significant challenges for the Indian forces, and neutralizing them was essential for the success to the larger operation to recapture Jhangar. Moving next, let's talk about the challenges faced by the Indian troops. Friends, as the Indian Army launched its offensive to recapture Jhangar in March 1948, they faced daunting challenges. This was not just a battle against an enemy force, it was a battle against nature and fortified defenses. The rugged, mountainous terrain of Jhangar combined with well-entrenched Pakistani defenses forced the Indian Army to carefully plan every move, making this a complex and a dangerous operation. So let's explore the challenges that Indian troops faced and how they managed to overcome during this critical battle. First, we need to understand the terrain of Jhangar. Friends, Jhangar is located in the region with a steep slope and a valley, a mountainous landscape that made troop movement incredibly difficult, especially for the mechanized units and heavy artillery. The terrain forced Indian forces to slow down their advances. Infantry units had to navigate narrow, exposed paths which made them vulnerable to the enemy fire. Moving equipment and supplies through the rugged landscape was no easy task, especially with Pakistani forces watching their every move. Then there was a problem of logistics. The difficult terrain limited the mobility of Indian forces, making it hard to transport supplies and reinforcements. Trucks and heavy equipment struggled to move across the narrow, rocky path, and even weather conditions complicated things further. Friends, ensuring that troops were well supplied with ammunition, food, and medical supplies required extensive planning. In some areas, vehicles simply couldn't be used, which meant everything had to be moved manually, slowing down the offensive. But it was not just the terrain. Indian troops also faced heavily fortified Pakistani positions. Over months, Pakistani forces had constructed trenches, bunkers, and sandbags fortification around Jhangar, making direct assault extremely costly for the Indian Army. These fortifications provided strong cover for the Pakistani forces, allowing them to hold their ground and inflict heavy casualties on Indian troops. Indian commanders had to carefully plan their attack to avoid being drawn into a prolonged engagement. Another major challenges came from the Pakistani artillery and mortars. These weapons were strategically placed to target key routes and choke points, making it difficult for the Indian forces to advance through the narrow mountain passes. So friends, how did the Indian Army overcome these formidable defenses? The key was in artillery support. Indian forces relied heavily on the precise artillery strikes to weaken Pakistani fortifications and before launching infantry assaults. These artillery barrages were essential for softening up the enemy positions, allowing them Indian infantry units to advance with fewer casualties. And without this precise use of artillery, the operation could have stalled under the weight of the Pakistani defenses. But friends, artillery alone was not enough. Indian infantry units had to coordinate their movement carefully. They often had to advance through narrow passes and exposed terrain, which made them vulnerable to the Pakistani fire. And to counter this, Indian units advanced under the cover of artillery, timing their movement to avoid being isolated or cut off by the enemy fire. Friends, so what made the recapture of Jhangar possible? It was the determination and tactical skill of the Indian Army. Despite facing rugged terrain and well-entrenched Pakistani defenses, Indian forces adapted. They used artillery support, careful planning and coordination to push the obstacles and reclaim this strategically vital town. Moving next, let's talk about Indians' reinforcement. Friends, let's rewind to March 1948. The Indian Army was preparing for one of the most crucial operations, the recapture of Jhangar. But this was not going to be easy. The Pakistani forces were entrenched. The terrain was unforgiving and success would depend not just on strategy but on the composition and timely arrival of reinforcements. The Indian Army brought in well-equipped force from across the Jammu and Kashmir, made up of battle-hardened infantry, artillery support, and logistic units. In this report, we'll break down how these forces came together and why their arrival and coordination were key to the success of the operation. First, let's talk about the reinforcement. By the time the Indian Army was ready for the final push on Jhangar, it was essential to bring in fresh troops. The earlier skirmishes had taken their toll, and India needed fresh manpower to bolster its forces. These reinforcements arrived from the different fronts across Jammu and Kashmir, fully equipped and ready for the fight. Why was this important? The timely arrival of these reinforcements gave Indian forces the manpower and the logistic support needed to launch a sustained offensive against well-entrenched Pakistani forces. But getting reinforcement to the front was not just about numbers, it was about strategy. Indian commanders had to move troops from different sectors where positions had been stabilized. Troops were transported by road and air, allowing for rapid deployment to the Jhangar front. This strategic movement ensured that Indian forces could launch a well-coordinated and timely offensive, giving them the upper hand in the battle to the recapture Jhangar. Now let's look at the composition of Indian forces. At the core of the offensive were the infantry units. And these were not just fresh recruits, these were battle-hardened troops who had already seen action in other parts of the Kashmir. Who were they? Units like the 5th Gorkha Rifle and the Rajput Regiment, forces with a reputation of excellence in the mountain warfare, were part of this effort. But infantry alone couldn't do it. Indian Army also deployed heavy artillery units to provide fire support, and these artillery units played a key role in softening enemy positions, particularly at Amblidhar and Khaman Koshagala, two well-fortified Pakistani strongholds. And let's not forget the engineers. Clearing obstacles, repairing roads, and ensuring that supply lines remained open were critical to the success of the operation. Indian engineers worked along the logistic teams to ensure that the ammunition, food, and medical supplies kept flowing in the front. The engineers and the logistical support kept the momentum going, ensuring that Indian Army could sustain its offensive on Jhangar without suffering from the supply shortages. And finally, let's talk about the air support. The rugged terrain around Jhangar made ground transportation difficult, so the Indian Air Force played a crucial role in transporting troops and supplies. And with the help of air reinforcements, Indian forces were able to stay well equipped and maintain their strength throughout the battle. This airlift not only brought in reinforcements quickly, but also ensured that essential supplies like ammunition, ration, and medical aid reached the frontline troops. And without this, maintaining the offensive momentum would have been almost impossible. So friends, to sum it up, we can say that the recapture of Jhangar was possible because of the timely arrival of reinforcements, the strategic movement of the battle-hardened infantry, artillery fire support, and the critical role of the Indian Air Force. Together, these elements created a well-coordinated force capable of pushing through one of the most challenging terrain in Jammu and Kashmir. Moving next we'll talk about tactical planning and objectives. Friends, as the Indian forces prepared to recapture Jhangar in March 1948, the operation was not just about launching an attack, it was about strategic planning and precise execution. Indian military commanders devised a series of coordinated attacks designed to weaken Pakistani defenses and secure control over these vital locations. In this report, we'll break down the objective and tactics behind the operation and how the Indian Army overcame the challenges posed by the entrenched enemy forces and rugged terrain. Friends, first and foremost, the Indian Army objective was the secure access to the Kashmir Valley. Jhangar was not just another town, it was a vital link between Jammu and the Kashmir Valley, essential for maintaining supply routes and communication lines. And without control over Jhangar, Indian forces would struggle to maintain logistical support for their operation in northern Jammu and Kashmir. This made its recapture an absolute priority for the Indian military. But regaining Jhangar was not going to be easy. Pakistani forces had fortified strongholds in surrounding areas such as Amritsar and Khaman Goshagala. The Indian offensive was designed to systematically degrade these defensive positions. Friends, by weakening Pakistani defenses at these strongholds, Indian forces could clear the path for a final assault on Jhangar, ensuring that Pakistani reinforcements would not be able to hold the town. Friends, Indian military planners adopted a phased approach to the offensive. Rather than launching a single and all-out attack, the plan has to weaken Pakistani defenses gradually through a phased assault. Phases. The initial phase included heavy artillery bombardment, targeting entrenched positions, followed by infantry assaults aimed at taking control of the high ground around Jhangar. The coordinated multi-front strategy was another key aspect of the offensive. Indian forces attacked Pakistani positions from multiple fronts simultaneously, ensuring that no single stronghold could be reinforced without leaving others exposed. Moving next, let's talk about the key tactics. Friends, one of the most crucial tactics in the Indian Army playbook was the use of artillery bombardment. Before launching infantry assaults, heavy artillery was used to soften enemy positions and break down Pakistani fortifications. This artillery barrage was instrumental in weakening entrenched Pakistani forces, especially in well-fortified areas like Amritsar, allowing Indian troops to advance with fewer casualties. The Indian Army also took full advantage of the rugged terrain, and by using the high ground and natural cover, Indian forces were able to launch surprise attacks on Pakistani positions. Earlier, reconnaissance mission had helped Indian commanders identify areas where troops could move undetected. Friends, by capitalizing on the terrain, Indian forces were able to minimize exposure to the Pakistani artillery and mortar fire, positioning themselves closer to the enemy lines before launching their final assault. Friends, after weeks of intense fighting and careful tactical execution, Indian forces launched the final coordinated assault on Jhangar. And by this point, Pakistani defenses had been sufficiently weakened, and Indian troops were in the strong position to retake the town. The recapture of Jhangar was not just a military victory, it was a strategic and psychological boost for the Indian forces. And with Jhangar back in Indian hands, the Indian Army could re-establish control over Jammu and Kashmir, giving them the momentum to push forward. Friends, to recap, we can say that the success of the Indian Army offensive strategy in recapturing Jhangar came down to a careful planning, a phased approach, and the effective use of coordinated multi-front attacks. And by systematically weakening Pakistani defenses and capitalizing on the terrain, Indian forces secured a decisive victory that shifted the momentum of the conflict. Friends, as the Indian Army advanced toward Jhangar in March 1948, they were not just fighting against a well-prepared enemy. They were battling rugged terrain and heavily fortified positions that made every step forward a challenge. Friends, in this report, we'll explore the obstacles Indian forces faced and how they overcome these challenges through careful planning and execution. One of the first challenges Indian troops encountered was a mountainous landscape surrounding Jhangar. The region is dominated by steep hills and a rugged terrain, which made the movement of the troops extremely difficult. But it was not just the mountains. The roads leading to Jhangar were unsuitable for the large-scale troops movement, especially when heavy equipment needed to be transported for a sustained offensive. The limited accessibility meant that Indian commanders had to rely on smaller, more nimble units and to traverse the difficult terrain. And this slowed down operation and required careful planning to avoid supply shortages and bottlenecks. Now let's talk about the Pakistani defenses. Pakistani forces had spent months fortifying their positions around the Jhangar. They had constructed bunker, trenches, and fortifications, creating an intricate defensive system that was designed to repel any Indian assault. But it was not just their fortifications. Pakistani troops had strategically placed artillery and mortars in elevated positions, giving them a significant tactical advantage. And from these elevated positions, Pakistani forces were able to launch long-range fire at Indian troops, effectively targeting their movement from a distance. This artillery fire inflicted significant casualties and forced Indian commanders to adapt their tactics, relying heavily on the precision artillery strikes to neutralize enemy position before advancing. So how did the Indian forces overcome these challenges? One of the key tactics was the use of sustained artillery bombardments. Indian commanders targeted Pakistani fortifications with heavy artillery, aiming to disrupt enemy defenses and create opening for the infantry units to exploit. Another critical component of the Indian strategy was the coordination between the infantry and artillery units. Infantry assaults were carefully synchronized with artillery fire, ensuring that Pakistani forces remained pinned down while Indian troops advanced. Friends, the recapture of Jhangar was no easy task for the Indian army. They faced rugged terrain and a well-entrenched Pakistani positions, but through careful planning, the effective use of artillery and the coordination of their forces, they were able to overcome these obstacles and achieve their objectives. Friends, before any major offensive, smart military planners first looked to understand the enemy defenses, and this was exactly what the Indian Army did in February 1948. It was not about rushing in, it was about being strategic. Indian forces began with a series of probing attacks and skirmishes. Small calculated moves that helped them test the water, gather vital intelligence, and understand the strength of the Pakistani defenses. So how did these early engagements help the Indian Army secure victory later on? Let's break it down. Friends, you see, probing attacks are the small-scale tactical engagements. They are not meant to defeat the enemy, but to test their defenses. And for the Indian Army, these attacks were essential to gathering intelligence. Indian commanders needed to know where Pakistani troops were entrenched and how they responded to attack and where their defenses were vulnerable. These probing attacks helped Indian forces understand the layout of Pakistani positions around the key strongholds like Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala. And without this information, the larger offensive might have far riskier. Between 7 and 29 February 1948, Indian troops carried out a series of skirmishes along the front lines near Jhangar. These were not major battles, but rather strategic engagements involving light infantry units advancing on the Pakistani lines. The idea was to test the Pakistani reaction times. Indian forces wanted to see how quickly their enemy could respond and how well their artillery was positioned and how deep their defensive lines ran. But probing attack were not just about shooting back and forth. These engagements were accompanied by recce missions where Indian forces watched Pakistani movements closely, collecting data on how they reinforced their positions, how quickly they counterattacked, and where their key artillery was placed. One of the most important outcomes of these probing attacks was the discovery of Pakistani weak points. Indian forces found that certain positions were not as heavily fortified as expected. This was critical because it allowed Indian artillery to focus on specific targets, creating opportunities for infantry to move in. These skirmishes were not just about gathering information, they also allowed Indian commanders to make tactical adjustments. With the insight gained, artillery units were repositioned to target specific enemy fortifications, and infantry units were reassigned to sectors where Pakistani defenses were weakest. And by making these adjustments, Indian forces were much better prepared for the large offensive. and that would follow in early March 1948. They were not walking into battle blind, they had real-time intelligence to guide their next step. And here is the thing, these probing attacks were not just about preparation. They were about building momentum, and by engaging in continuous small skirmishes, Indian forces kept the pressure on the Pakistanis. The goal was simple, force the Pakistani troops to expend resources, manpower and energy even before the main battle began. This strategy wore down Pakistani defenses, and by the time the Indian army launched the full-scale attack, Pakistani forces were already weakened and less capable of mounting a strong defense. Their groundwork had been laid and the Indian forces were ready to push forward. Friends, let me take you back to March 1948. The Indian army was preparing for its final push to recapture Jhangar. But before they could make their move, two key obstacles stood in their way, Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala. Two heavily fortified positions, stronghold. They were no ordinary positions. They were the backbone of Pakistani defenses and line in the region. And to reach Jhangar, India had to neutralize them. Friends, today we'll talk about decisive battles at these strongholds, how the Indian army executed coordinated attacks, and how these engagements paved the way for the final victory. Let's start with the Amblidhar. This was not just another defensive position, it was a crucial stronghold. Perched on the elevated terrain, Amblidhar gave the Pakistani forces a commanding view of the region. And from this high ground, they could monitor Indian troops' movement, disrupt supply lines, and hold key routes that led into Jhangar. Friends, Amblidhar location was vital. Pakistani forces used it to control communication lines and supply routes, which meant that the Indian forces capturing Amblidhar was essential. And without securing this position, advancing on Jhangar would have been impossible. So how did the Indian army tackle this? In early March 1948, they launched a coordinated assault combining artillery bombardments with infantry advances. The goal to dislodge the entrenched Pakistani forces and take control of the high ground. The strategy was clear. First, artillery was used to weaken Pakistani fortifications, and then infantry units moved in, targeting key defensive positions. Timing was critical. Indian commanders planned the attack to maximize the element of surprise, catching Pakistani forces off guard. And what was the result? The fall of Amblidhar was a turning point. Pakistani forces were forced to retreat and Indian troops secured control over the high strategic ground. This victory was Indian forces a tactical advantage, and with Amblidhar secured, Indian troops could now effectively target Pakistani positions in surrounding area, paving the way for the further advances towards Jhangar. Next we have Khaman Goshagala. This was another fortified position, guarding the western approach of the to Jhangar, and for Pakistani forces, this stronghold was crucial. It blocked Indian forces from advancing on Jhangar from multiple directions and helped to protect the supply routes. Pakistani troops relied on Khaman Goshagala to reinforce their positions in Jhangar. And so for Indian forces, capturing this stronghold was just as important as Amblidhar. Without it, the path to Jhangar would remain blocked. Now here is where Indian strategy shone through. Simultaneously with the attack on Amblidhar, Indian forces launched an assault on Khaman Goshagala. This was not by chance, it was a coordinated effort. And by attacking both strongholds at the same time, Indian forces ensured that Pakistani troops could not reinforce their position. The Indian army used a mix of artillery fire and infantry maneuver to cut off Pakistani supply lines and isolate their forces. The coordinated strikes disrupted the Pakistani defense network and making it difficult for them to hold their ground. And once again, Indian forces prevailed. The capture of Khaman Goshagala was another blow to the Pakistani defenses. With both Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala neutralized, the Indian troops had the upper hand. They were now poised for the final push into the Jhangar, with Pakistani defenses crumbling under the pressure. So why did these assaults work so well? The Indian Army decision to simultaneously attack both Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala was a tactical masterstroke. By hitting multiple fronts at once, Indian forces divided Pakistani defenses, forcing them to respond to the multiple threats at the same time. This multi-front strategy disrupted the coordination among Pakistani troops. They could not mount an effective counterattack because they were too stretched trying to defend both strongholds. And here is where it all came together. The fall of both Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala didn't just weaken Pakistani defenses, it set the stage for the final assault on the Jhangar. These coordinated victories were crucial. They were not only secured key strategic positions but also broke the spirit of Pakistani forces, leading to a swift Indian victory in the Battle of Jhangar. Friends, to sum it up, we can say that the Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala were the two key strongholds that stood in the way of Indian recapture of Jhangar. And by coordinating simultaneous attack on both fronts, the Indian troops disrupted Pakistani defenses, gained control over vital positions, and paved the way for the decisive victory. Friends, before any major battle, a smart army doesn't just charge in. They plan, they gather intelligence, and they test the enemy defenses. That's exactly where the Indian Army did in February 1948, before launching their final offensive to recapture Jhangar. The probing attack they conducted were not about winning the battle immediately. They were about learning. These small tactical skirmishes allowed Indian commanders to figure out where and how to strike. Today we'll talk about the outcomes of that crucial probing phase and how it set the stage for decisive victory. Friends, so what was the first goal of this probing attack? It was all about gathering intelligence. Indian forces needed to understand the layout of the Pakistani defenses, where their artillery was placed, how their supply lines worked, and which positions were heavily fortified. This intelligence became the foundation for the larger offensive. It allowed Indian commanders to pinpoint weak spots in the Pakistani defenses and ensuring that when they launched their final attack, they would strike the enemy where it hurt the most. Friends, but the probing attack didn't stop at gathering information. They also tested the Pakistani response. Indian forces wanted to see how quickly Pakistani troops could react to an attack and how well they could reinforce their positions. Now, beyond intelligence, these probing attacks also had another very important effect. They weakened the enemy. Each skirmish may have been small, but over time they began to wear down Pakistani forces. And by the time the Indian army was ready to launch its final offensive, Pakistani forces had already been drained. Their resources, their manpower, and their ability to hold key positions had been eroded, giving India the upper hand. And here is another crucial outcome. These probing attacks didn't just exhaust Pakistani forces, they disrupted their coordination. You see, by keeping the pressure on with the frequent skirmishes, Indian forces made it difficult for the Pakistani commanders to consolidate their defenses. This meant that when India finally launched its multi-pronged assault, Pakistani forces were stretched too thin to effectively counter the attacks. Their inability to maintain effective communication left them vulnerable to being overrun. And now let's talk about how these probing attacks helped India to refine its strategy. Based on the intelligence gathered during this phase, Indian commanders were able to make critical adjustments. Artillery units were moved to target specific enemy strongholds, and infantry units were strategically assigned to the areas where Pakistani defenses were weakest. These tactical adjustments made the final offensive far more effective, but by the time Indian forces launched their full-scale attack, they knew exactly where to hit and how to win. And finally, let's not underestimate the psychological impact of these probing attacks. By successfully testing the enemy's defenses and identifying vulnerabilities, Indian forces entered the final offensive with greater confidence. This boost in the morale was a game changer. Indian troops went into the large battle not only better prepared but also more confident in their ability to overcome the enemy. So to recap, we can say that the probing phase was more than just testing the waters. It was about gathering the intelligence, weakening the enemy, and refining the strategy for a larger offensive. These small but critical engagements set the stage for a successful recapture of Jhangar, giving Indian forces a clear path to victory. Moving next, let's talk about the second phase operation. Friends, in March 1948, the Indian Army campaign to recapture Jhangar hinged on one critical battle, the assault on Amblidhar. This was no ordinary fight. Amblidhar was a fortified Pakistani stronghold perched on the elevated terrain that gave their forces a strategic advantage over the entire region. Let's start with the strategic importance of Amblidhar. This stronghold was located on high ground, giving Pakistani forces a commanding view of the entire battlefield. And from here, they could monitor Indian movements, control key approaches to the Jhangar, and even disrupt the Indian supply lines. But it was not about the location that made Amblidhar tough to crack. Pakistani forces had turned into a fortress. There were bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions dug deep into the terrain, allowing them to mount a strong resistance. So how did the Indian Army prepare for the assault? Before sending in the infantry, they needed to weaken Pakistani defenses. Artillery units were positioned to bombard these key enemy fortifications and testing bunkers and defensive positions that posed a great threat. And with the artillery bombardment complete, it was time for the infantry assault. Indian troops launched a coordinated attack using the cover of terrain and the weakened Pakistani defenses to move closer to the enemy positions. And after hours of intense fighting, the Indian Army succeeded in capturing Amblidhar. That is, Pakistani forces were forced to retreat, leaving their stronghold behind. Friends, the fall of Amblidhar was a major turning point. It disrupted the entire Pakistani defensive structure in the region and allowed Indian forces to move forward with a clearer path toward Jhangar. But it was not just about taking Amblidhar, it was about what the victory meant for the larger campaign. With Amblidhar under the Indian control, Pakistani defenses were significantly weakened. The remaining positions around Jhangar were left unexposed. Friends, another crucial factor was the momentum. This victory gave Indian forces. Capturing Amblidhar was not just a strategic win, it was a psychological boost. Indian troops now had the confidence to press forward, knowing they had broken through one of the toughest parts of the Pakistani defenses. Friends, to recap, the successful assault on Amblidhar was a pivotal moment in the campaign to recapture Jhangar. By disrupting Pakistani defenses and opening a path toward the town, the Indian army gained the upper hand. And this victory not only weakened the enemy's defensive line but also built the momentum that ultimately led to the recapture of Jhangar. Friends, as the Indian forces advanced toward Jhangar in 1948, there was one more Pakistani stronghold that stood in their way, that is Khaman Gosha Gala. These positions was crucial to the Pakistani defensive network, controlling vital supply routes and preventing Indian forces from advancing easily. The capture of Khaman Gosha Gala was not just another victory, it was the move that disrupted Pakistani defenses and set the stage for the final push to retake Jhangar. Let's break down why this engagement was so critical. First, let's talk about the strategic location of Khaman Gosha Gala. Positioned near vital supply routes leading into the Jhangar, this stronghold was a key part of the Pakistani defensive network. Pakistani forces could not control the western approach to Jhangar, making it difficult for the Indian forces to advance without being disrupted. So controlling Khaman Gosha Gala gave Pakistani forces the ability to reinforce their position in Jhangar and disrupt Indian troops' movement. For the Indian army, this made it a primary objective in their overall battle plan. But it was not just about location. Khaman Gosha Gala was also heavily fortified. Pakistani troops had built trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions to make it one of the most challenging obstacles for the Indian forces. So how did the Indian army plan their attack on such a heavily fortified positions? They began with a well-coordinated assault, combining artillery bombardments with the infantry advances. The goal was to weaken Pakistani defenses before the infantry moved in. Friends, once the artillery had done its job, it was a time for the infantry to advance. Moving under the cover of darkness, Indian troops used the terrain to their advantage. The element of the surprise played a crucial role here, catching the Pakistani forces off guard. And this coordinated movement allowed Indian infantry to secure Khaman Goshagala with relatively low casualties, further weakening the overall Pakistani defensive network. So what was the impact of capturing Khaman Goshagala? By taking control of this stronghold, Indian forces effectively cut off the critical supply routes that Pakistani troops had been using to reinforce their positions in Jhangar. And here is the most significant outcome by capturing Khaman Goshagala. Indian forces cleared the path for final push toward Jhangar. And with Pakistani defenses in disarray, the remaining positions could not hold off the advancing Indian army. Friends, to recap, the capture of Khaman Goshagala was a pivotal moment in the campaign to retake Jhangar. And by disrupting Pakistani defenses and cutting off their supply lines, Indian forces set the final stage for their final push and eventual victory. Moving next, let's talk about the coordinated attack. Friends, in March 1948, the Indian army was preparing for its final push to recapture Jhangar. But before that could happen, two critical Pakistani strongholds had to be neutralized: Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala. These two strong positions were crucial for Pakistani defenses, controlling key supply routes and access points to the Jhangar. The coordinated attack on these strongholds didn't just disrupt the Pakistani defenses, they were the foundation for the decisive victory that followed. Let's look into it. Friends, let's begin with the strategic significance of these two positions. Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala were heavily fortified and vital for the Pakistani defenses in the region. They controlled critical supply routes and access points to the Jhangar, making them essential for maintaining Pakistani control. But it was not just about attacking these positions individually, it was about synchronization. The Indian army launched simultaneous assault on both Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala. The idea was simple: stretch Pakistani forces thin, preventing them from reinforcing either positions effectively. So how did the Indian army execute this attack? Let's start with the Amblidhar. Indian forces combined artillery bombardment with infantry advances. The focus was on breaking through the fortified defenses, targeting bunkers and strategic points with precise artillery fire. And at the same time, Indian infantry units launched an assault on Khaman Goshagala. Using artillery support, they weakened Pakistani positions before advancing on foot. The terrain played a key role here and did the element of surprise. Pakistani forces were caught off guard, unable to mount a counterattack. So what was the larger impact of these coordinated assault? The success at Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala severely disrupted Pakistani defenses. And with these strongholds lost, Pakistani forces struggled to regroup and defend their remaining positions near Jhangar. But beyond these just weakening their defenses, these victories cleared the way for the final offensive of Jhangar. And with Pakistani forces disorganized and unable to hold their positions, Indian troops now had the momentum for a decisive assault. Moving next, let's talk about the key battle Amblidhar per se. Friends, let me take you back to the March 1948, a key momentum in the Indian-Pakistani conflict. The Indian army was preparing for the final push to recapture Jhangar. But one heavily fortified position stood in their way, that is Amblidhar. This was not just another battle, it was a decisive one. Amblidhar controlled the critical supply routes and gave Pakistani forces a tactical advantage. So how did Indian forces capture it? Why was it so important? Let's break it down. Friends, first let's understand why Amblidhar was so important. Located on the elevated terrain, it gave Pakistani forces a tactical advantage. And from this high ground, they could monitor Indian troops' movement, control key approaches, and defend the vital supply routes leading to Jhangar. But it was not just the location, it was the fortifications. Pakistani forces had transformed Amritsar into a stronghold. With bunkers, trenches, and artillery placements, it was designed to repel any Indian advance, making the direct assault incredibly challenging. Now let's talk about the Indian Army strategy. Before sending in their troops, they launched a sustained artillery bombardment. Indian artillery units targeted Pakistani bunkers and fortified positions at Amritsar, aiming to weaken their defenses and disrupt their ability to resist. Once the artillery had done its job, it was the time for the infantry to move in. Indian troops launched a coordinated assault. They moved strategically using the terrain to their advantage, advancing carefully to avoid the exposure to the Pakistani fire. And with Amritsar under their control, Indian forces had a major breakthrough. Pakistani troops were forced to retreat, leaving a significant gap in their defensive line. But what did this mean for the larger campaign? The fall of Amritsar weakened the entire Pakistani defensive line. Without control of this key position, Pakistani forces could not effectively defend the approach to the Jhangar. And there is more. This victory didn't just open a path, it gave Indian forces momentum. And with Pakistani forces in retreat, Indian troops could press forward with renewed confidence. They knew they had a clear shot at Jhangar and morale was high. So to sum it up, the battle for the Amritsar was not just another skirmish. It was a pivotal moment. The fortified positions, its strategic importance, and the Indian Army well-planned assault all contributed to the fall of stronghold. So capturing Amritsar was a key to the disrupting Pakistani defenses and paving the way for the final push to recapture Jhangar. Friends, let's take you back to the March 1948. The Indian Army was making its final push toward Jhangar. But before they could get there, they had to tackle a major obstacle, Amritsar. And this was not just any stronghold, it was located in a rugged mountainous terrain that favored the Pakistani defenders. It was not just the natural landscape that was a challenge though. Pakistani forces had turned Amritsar into a fortress, making it incredibly difficult for the Indian forces to advance. So how did the India break through? Let's break down the topographical challenges and a well-entrenched defenses they had to overcome. Let's start with the terrain. Amritsar, which was located in a mountainous region with steep slopes, rocky cliffs, and narrow passes. For Indian Army, this meant that moving troops and equipment was slow and difficult. The defenders, Pakistani forces, were positioned on a high ground, giving them a clear line of sight over Indian troops as they tried to advance. And it didn't stop there. The rugged terrain also meant that the Indian forces had to carefully plan their logistics. They couldn't rely on the large mechanized units. Instead, they had to use lighter equipment and rely heavily on the infantry tactics. And now let's talk about the Indian defenses. The Indian forces were up against. The Pakistani troops had turned the Amritsar into a fortress, with trenches, bunkers, and artillery placements set up on their high ground. And these positions were designed to withstand artillery fire and making it difficult for the Indian infantry to break through. But that was not the only problem. Pakistani forces had placed artillery and mortars at key positions around Amritsar, allowing them to target Indian troops as they advanced through the valley and the narrow passes. So how did the Indian Army overcome these challenges? First, they relied on the prolonged artillery bombardment. This was not just random firing. Indian forces targeted known enemy positions to weaken the Pakistani fortifications. The goal was simple: disrupt the enemy's defenses and reduce their ability to launch counter-attack. Once the artillery bombardment had softened the defenses, it was a time for the Indian infantry to move in. But this was not a straightforward march. Indian troops had to advance carefully through the rugged terrain, using the natural landscape to their advantage. The infantry movements were well coordinated, with units advancing in waves to take advantage of the gaps created by the artillery. Indian troops used the terrain to shield their movements and avoid direct exposure to the Pakistani fire. This careful coordination was key to overcoming both the difficult terrain and the entrenched defenses. Friends, in summary, the assault on Amritsar was a masterclass in military planning. The Indian Army had to navigate two major challenges: the rugged mountainous terrain and the well-entrenched Pakistani defenses. Friends, though the combination of precise artillery strikes, well-coordinated infantry movements, and the ability to adapt to the difficult landscape, Indian forces successfully captured this pivotal stronghold, opening the path to Jhangar. Friends, in March 1948, a turning point in the Battle of Jhangar, the Indian Army was preparing to capture one of the most heavily fortified positions in the region, Amritsar. But this was no ordinary fight. It required a careful, coordinated, multi-pronged attack, combining the strength of the infantry, artillery, and even air support to break through the defenses. This tactical coordination was the key to the Indian success in capturing the stronghold. First, let's talk about the infantry. Friends, the backbone of this operation. The Indian troops had to navigate through difficult terrain with steep slopes and narrow passes. But they didn't just charge in blindly. Indian forces advanced, strategically using the cover of night and the rugged landscape to get as close as possible to the enemy without being seen. But the infantry didn't act alone. Far from it. Artillery support played a critical role. Indian artillery units launched a sustained bombardment targeting key Pakistani strongholds, including bunkers and high ground positions. These precise strikes were designed to weaken the enemy's fortification before the infantry moved in. And then now let's talk about air support. Friends, air support was a game changer in this battle. While ground forces engaged directly, the Indian Army also deployed aircraft to provide crucial recce and precision strikes. From the skies, aircraft could identify hidden enemy positions such as bunkers and artillery placements, giving Indian troops critical intelligence on where to strike next. Air support didn't just gather intelligence, it also launched targeted strikes against Pakistani defenses. And by disrupting communication lines and hitting fortified positions, air support played a vital role in weakening Pakistani coordination ahead of the infantry assault. Friends, now what made this operation truly effective was the coordination between air and ground forces. As they provide cover from the above, infantry and artillery units worked in perfect sync to capitalize on these weaknesses on the ground. So how did the Indian Army execute this coordinated attack? It was all about synchronization. The infantry advanced under the cover of artillery and air bombardments, which meant that the Pakistani forces had to defend on multiple fronts. This multi-pronged approach stretched Pakistani defenses thin, leaving them scrambling to respond to attack from all directions. Finally, as the Indian Army moved in, they captured the Pakistani positions at Amritsar, including fortified bunkers and artillery placements. These were not just tactical victories, they were strategic wins that effectively broke the back of the Pakistani defenses. Friends, to recap, the Indian Army multi-pronged attack on Amritsar was a masterclass in coordination, combining infantry, artillery, and air support. Indian forces overwhelmed Pakistani defenses and secured a key victory that paved the way for recapture of Jhangar. Moving next, let's talk about the key battle of Khaman-Koshagala. Friends, in the fight for Jhangar, one of the key objectives stood in the way of Indian forces, the Pakistani stronghold of Khaman-Koshagala. This was not just a well-defended position, it was strategically vital. And capturing it would break the back of the Pakistani defenses and pave the way for the final Indian offensive to retake Jhangar. So how did Indian forces manage to capture this critical point? Let's break it down. Friends, Khaman-Koshagala was positioned along the key supply routes leading directly to Jhangar. This location gave Pakistani forces a huge advantage. They could reinforce their defenses and disrupt Indian advances, making it an essential part of their overall strategy. But it was not just the location. It was the fortified defenses. Pakistani forces had turned Khaman-Koshagala into a formidable fortress. and with bunkers, artillery placements and trenches, they had the advantage of elevated positions and strong defensive lines that could hold off the Indian advances. Now let's talk about the Indian strategy to capture this stronghold. Before the infantry could move in, artillery was called in to weaken the Pakistani defenses. Indian artillery units targeted key enemy positions, aiming to disrupt fortifications and prevent a coordinated defense. Following the air artillery strikes, it was a time for the infantry to launch their assault. Indian troops launched strategically using natural terrain for cover and attempting to outflank the Pakistani defenders. Their goal was to engage in close quarters combats, targeting key strong points one by one. Friends, after fierce fighting, Indian forces succeeded in capturing Khaman Goshagala, and this victory was a major blow to the Pakistani defenses, leaving their remaining positions around Jhangar vulnerable to further attack. Friends, so what was the larger impact of this victory? The loss of Khaman Goshagala severely weakened Pakistani defensive lines, and without this key stronghold, Pakistani forces were left stretched thin and struggled to regroup and reinforce their remaining positions. With Khaman Goshagala now under Indian control, the path of the Jhangar was clear. The disorganized Pakistani forces could no longer hold off the Indian advances, allowing the Indian army to move swiftly and prepare for the decisive assault that would recapture the town. Friends, so to recap, the capture of Khaman Goshagala was not just a tactical win, it was a strategic breakthrough. Moving next, let's talk about the challenging terrain and the fortifications. Friends, today we take you back to one of the most challenging battles of 1948, the assault on the Khaman Goshagala. This was no ordinary stronghold. Positioned in a rugged mountainous region, Pakistani troops had turned it into a fortress. For the Indian army, this was not just a battle against an entrenched enemy, it was a battle against steep cliffs and narrow passes, and the natural advantage of the terrain. So, how did the Indian army manage to capture such formidable positions? Let's break it down. Let's start with the terrain. Friends, Khaman Goshagala was located in a mountainous region with steep slopes, rocky outcrops, and the narrow passes. These features made the troop movements incredibly difficult for the Indian forces. The terrain favored the defenders. Pakistani forces controlled the high ground, giving them a clear view of all the approaches. And that's not all. The rough terrain also made it hard for the transport supplies open. Friends, vehicles couldn't move through these steep, rocky paths, so Indian forces had to rely on the foot soldiers to carry equipments. This limited the use of heavy artillery and forced Indian troops to rely on the light support. Pakistani forces were well prepared. They had transformed Khaman Goshagala into a fortress. With trenches, bunkers, and artillery placements, they had fortified the high ground, turning it into a nearly impenetrable defensive lines. And then there was a high ground advantage. Pakistani forces made excellent use of it, positioning artillery and machine guns at elevated positions. From there, they could direct fire on the Indian troops as they tried to move forward. Any approach to the stronghold meant facing heavy fire from the above. So how did the Indian army overcome these challenges? It all began with a sustained artillery bombardment. Indian artillery units conducted targeted strikes against key Pakistani fortifications, bunker trenches, and artillery positions. The goal was simple: weaken the defender, break down the fortification, and prepare for the infantry assault. Next came the infantry assault. But this was not a head-on attack. Indian soldiers advanced carefully, using the rugged terrain for cover. They timed their movement with artillery support, ensuring they were protected as they moved closer to the Pakistani positions. In the end, friends, the assault on Khaman Goshagala was not just a battle, it was a test of tactical planning, logistical coordination, and sheer determination. Moving next, let's talk about coordination Indian tactics. Friends, when we talk about strategic brilliance in the warfare, the Battle of Khaman Goshagala is a prime example. This was no ordinary assault. Indian forces employed a multi-pronged strategy, combining the effort of infantry, artillery, and air support to break through heavily fortified Pakistani defenses. Each part of the military played its role. And today I'll take you through how this well-coordinated effort paved the way for the Indian victory at Khaman Goshagala. Let's start with the infantry, which formed the backbone of this operation. Indian infantry units were tasked with engaging Pakistani troops in close quarter combat once the artillery has softened up the defenses. But it was not easy. Rugged terrain, narrow passes and fortified positions all made the advance difficult. As the Pakistani defensive line weakened, infantry units advanced from multiple directions, gradually taking control of the key bunkers and strongholds. These coordinated advances allowed Indian forces to outflank the enemy and engage them effectively. Now, the role of artillery in this battle cannot be understated. Before the infantry assault, Indian forces employed sustained artillery bombardments, targeting Pakistani bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions. These strikes aimed to disrupt the defensive setup and reduce the resistance faced by the advancing troops. The artillery fire played a critical role in weakening the Pakistani positions. By neutralizing key strongholds, Indian forces dramatically reduced the enemy's ability to resist the infantry assault. Then there was the air support, which provided a crucial advantage on the battlefield. Air recce gave Indian commanders real-time information about the enemy position, artillery placement, and supply routes. Intelligence that was impossible to gather from the ground alone. In addition to recce, Indian forces conducted targeted airstrikes, hitting enemy supply lines and disrupting troops' movement. These strikes complemented the artillery bombardment, further weakening the Pakistani defenses. Friends, the true strength of the Indian assault on Khaman Goshagala lay in the synchronization of infantry, artillery, and air support. These forces worked in perfect coordination, maintaining constant pressure on Pakistani defenses from multiple fronts, overwhelming them with simultaneous attacks. And with Khaman Goshagala capture, the Indian army had cleared the way for the final offensive to retake Jhangar. With Pakistani defenses crumbling, Indian forces were able to advance with minimal resistance. Friends, to sum up, the multi-pronged assault on Khaman Goshagala was a prime example of Indian Army ability to coordinate infantry, artillery and air support to achieve a decisive victory. And by combining these forces, Indian troops overcame heavily fortified Pakistani defenses, setting the stage for final push to recapture Jhangar. Moving next, let's talk about the last, that is about the conclusion of operation. Friends, every major battle of military offensive began with something crucial information. Before launching a full-scale assault, commanders need to know exactly what they are up against. And that's where the probing attacks come in. These are the small strategic skirmishes designed to gather vital intelligence and test the enemy defenses. Today we are going to look at how the Indian army used these probing attacks and to gain the upper hand in their battle to retake Jhangar. First, let's talk about the main goal. These probing attacks, that is about intelligence gathering. Rather than launching an all-out assault, small tactical units are sent in to test the waters. These units engage enemy forces in controlled skirmishes to gather critical information about the strength, layout, and readiness of the enemy. These skirmishes also serve as another important purpose, that they are used to test how quickly and effectively the enemy respond to attack. In a probing attack, Indian forces engage Pakistani troops not to capture territory but to gauge their reaction times and understand their tactics. So how do these probing attacks actually work? Friends, they are carried out by the small infantry or recce units. Team, they are light and mobile. Their goal is not to hold territory but to provoke a reaction from the enemy, gather the information they need and then retreat. But it is not just about random skirmishes. These probing attacks are often directed at suspected weak points in the enemy defenses. Maybe a section of a front line looks under-defended, or there is a delay in how fast reinforcements arrive. Friends, now what happened after the probing attacks? The intelligence gathered is used to adjust tactics. If an area is found to be heavily fortified, Indian forces might decide to avoid a direct confrontation there. Instead, they'll shift the focus to the area that they are less defended. Finally, these probing attacks are like a dress rehearsal for the real thing. They give a commander a clear picture of where to strike and how to strike, and what resources they need to secure a victory. Friends, let's look into the coordinated attack on Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala, a tactical masterstroke by Indian forces. Friends, every major victory in the battlefield is a combination of careful planning, strategy, and flawless execution. The Battle of Jhangar was no different. Two key Pakistani strongholds, Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala, stood tall, fortified, and prepared, defending crucial routes. But when Indian forces launched a coordinated attack on these two positions, it was nothing short of a strategic masterclass. Let's break it down and understand why this was so crucial in shaping the final victory. Let's start with the Amblidhar. Perched high on the elevated terrain, this was not just another stronghold, it was a strategic fortress. From here, Pakistani forces could monitor key supply routes leading directly to Jhangar. And if you control the Amblidhar, you control the approaches to Jhangar itself. Why was this important? Because Amblidhar was one of the biggest barriers standing between Indian forces and the goal of recapturing Jhangar. And losing this stronghold would be a huge blow to the Pakistani defenses. Then there was the Khaman Goshagala. Positioned further west, this stronghold was critical for protecting Pakistani supply lines and blocking any Indian attempt to encircle Jhangar from multiple directions. Capturing both these strongholds would mean disrupting the entire Pakistani defensive network. So how did the Indian forces plan to crack this fortress? First, it was a combination of artillery and infantry. The attack began with a sustained artillery bombardment. Indian artillery targeted Pakistani bunkers and strongholds with one goal, that is disorient the defenders and soften up the stronghold. Once the artillery had weakened the defenses, it was a time for infantry to move in. And now here is where it gets interesting. The Indian infantry didn't just rush in, they timed their movement with precision. While Pakistani forces were trying to recover from the artillery strikes, Indian troops advanced, engaging in close quarter combats. The result, after the intense fighting, Indian forces captured Amblidhar, forcing Pakistani troops to retreat. Why was this significant? The fall of Amblidhar opened up a clear path to Jhangar and weakened the Pakistani defenses, setting up the stage for the next phase. Friends, while Amblidhar was under attack, the Indian army had already set its sight on the second stronghold, that is Khaman Goshagala. The tactics, very similar. The assault started with artillery fire aimed at weakening Pakistani defenses. But here is the key. These two assaults were happening simultaneously. This forces Pakistani forces to split the attention and defend the multiple fronts. This is what we call a multi-front strategy. Indian forces launched their infantry attack on Khaman Goshagala just as Pakistani forces were struggling to hold on to Amblidhar. Confusion set in, and within a short time, Khaman Goshagala also fell into the Indian hands. Why does this matter? Because with the fall of both the stronghold, the Pakistani defensive network was in complete disarray. So what was the larger impact of capturing these two strongholds? For Pakistani forces, this was nothing short of a disaster. Their defensive lines were shattered and their remaining positions in Jhangar were left completely exposed. For Indian forces, this was the momentum boost they needed. With both Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala under their control, Indian troops could regroup, plan and prepare for the final offensive. Pakistani forces, on the other hand, were left stretched thin, unable to regroup the resist the coming assault. Friends, to sum up, we can say that the coordinated attack on the Amblidhar and Khaman Goshagala were tactical game changers. And by capturing these two strongholds, Indian forces were able to break the backbone of Pakistani defensive, paving the way for the decisive offensive that would eventually lead to the recapture of Jhangar. Moving next, let's talk about the Operation Vijay, the final assault. Friends, picture this. March 1948, the Indian army, armed with meticulous planning and unmatched determination, prepared to launch a decisive strike, Operation Vijay. Their mission? To recapture Jhangar, a town of immense strategic value in the Jammu and Kashmir region. A town that both India and Pakistan desperately wanted to control. This operation was more than just an assault. It was a moment that would shape the course of the conflict. But why was Jhangar so important? This town was not just a dot on the map, it was the heart of the logistics. It controlled the key supply routes, the lifelines of communication and reinforcements. Whoever controlled Jhangar could control the flow of the troops and supplies throughout the northern region. For India, recapturing Jhangar meant securing the strategic upper hand. The stakes were high, and it was not just about winning the town, it was about securing dominance and ensuring that the enemy didn't get a foothold in this crucial region. But here is the challenge. Pakistani forces were ready. After capturing Jhangar, they didn't just sit back, they turned the town into a fortress. They used the high ground, built fortification trenches, and placed artillery, creating a defensive position that was hard to breach. So how did the Indian commanders plan the attack? They didn't put their all eggs in one basket. Operation Vijay was designed as a multi-pronged offensive. This was not just one frontal attack, it was a combination of infantry, artillery and air support, coming at the Pakistani forces from multiple directions. Friends, Indian forces divided into smaller units. Each unit had its task. Some focused on cutting supply lines, others on targeting artillery positions, while air recce provided real-time intelligence, keeping Indian forces one step ahead of the game. Timing, as they say, is everything. Indian commanders didn't rush. They conducted probing attacks, small skirmishes to test the Pakistani defenses, and when the weaknesses became clear, that's when they struck. Coordinated attacks from all fronts. This was the key to success. Coordinating the infantry, artillery and air support so that Pakistani forces were constantly on the back foot, unable to regroup or mount a counter-offensive. And it was a textbook precision in military planning. And then came the March 18, 1948. The final assault began. Indian artillery began pounding the Pakistani fortifications, neutralizing their defensive positions. Indian infantry advanced into multiple directions, forcing the Pakistani troops into chaos. Despite the heavy fortification, the multi-pronged attack was too much for the Pakistani forces to handle, and they were eventually forced to retreat. The result? A swift and a decisive victory for Indian army with minimal casualties. A testament to the careful planning had gone into the Operation Vijay. Friends, but let's not forget this victory didn't happen overnight. Indian forces had already secured key positions before the final assault. The capture of Amlidhar and Khaman Goshagala was instrumental, and these strongholds were part of the larger defense network around Jhangar. And by taking them first, Indian forces had already weakened the Pakistani lines. So friends, here we come to the end of part 1 of chapter 8, Recapture of Jhangar. Friends, please do like, share and subscribe among your friends and stay tuned for more updates. Thank you.